welcome to Inquiring Minds, the Writing and Literacy podcast. I'm Hein, your host. We are delighted to have you join us today on Inquiring Mind as we delve into discussions relevant to the writing and literacy fields.
Hello everyone, I am Zixin. I'm Hein's co-host today, and the Writing Literacy Week podcast is committed to highlighting scholarly work, exploring current topics, and nurturing dialogues among members of the special interest group and the wider writing literacy community. Our aim is to foster discussion nationwide among faculty, graduate students, and anyone intrigued by timely themes within the field of writing, literacies, and education at large.
In this episode of Inquiring Mind, we are excited to be joined by 6 guests who are going to contribute to this discussion on topic of this episode, solidarity through immigrant literacies. Please welcome Ms. Ming Ming Cheung, Dr. Joel Berends, Dr. Jin Kyeong Jung, Dr. Jungmin Kwon, Dr. Lucía Cárdenas Curiel, Dr. Vaughn W. Now, each guest will introduce themselves. Please share your name, your institutional affiliation, and anything else you believe is relevant to our discussion.
Hi everyone, my name is Ming Ming Cheung. I'm a third-year PhD student at Michigan State University, and I'm broadly interested in digital literacies for transnational Asian youth. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and talk about a chapter I recently co-wrote with my advisor, Dr. Lucía Cárdenas, and another graduate student, Yadunde Alabidi, where we explore how visiting community spaces can be a way to support pedagogical solidarity.
Hi all, I'm Joel Berends, and I'm an assistant professor of teacher education and a postdoctoral researcher with the MI Diaries project, all at Michigan State University. I also served as one of the guest editors for the Theory and Practice into Practice, as well as a co-author.
Hello, I'm Jin Kyeong Jung, assistant professor at Texas Tech University. I was one of the guest editors for the recently published Theory into Practice special issue on solidarities across Asian, Black, Latinx, and indigenous communities. And I'm also one of the authors of an article included in that issue. I'm glad to be here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jungmin Kwon. I am an associate professor in the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. My research focuses on transnational lives and literacies of immigrant children and families. I'm also a mother of 2 bilingual children, so my own experience as a mother scholar informed my work. I was one of the guest editors of the Theory into Practice special issue, and I'm excited to discuss the article that I recently co-authored with Dr. Sun, Dr. Oja, and Kristin Sun Rim. So thank you for having me.
Hi, my name is Lucía Cárdenas Curiel. Thank you for this invitation to share our work. And again, thank you for the editors that carefully read our work and made it so much better. I am Lucía, as I said, and an associate professor of bilingual multilingual education in the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. And my research focuses on bilingualism, multilingualism, biliteracy development, and multiliteracy practices to promote equitable education for bilingual multilingual learners. I'm a first-generation immigrant from Mexico and a bilingual Latina scholar. Also a Spanish language educator in Mexico and in the US, and an ESL by multilingual teacher educator.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vaughn Watson. I'm an associate professor of English education, working with pre-service teachers and doctoral students in literacy research at Michigan State University. I was also one of the guest editors of the Theory into Practice special issue with my colleagues here. Really excited to engage that work and co-author on one of the papers in the issue. And I'm also co-editor of a recent book published with Routledge called Theories, Models, and Practices of Literacy. And it's co-edited with Misty Sailors, Dedelia Nunez, me, James Hoffman, and Donna Alverman. And it's one of the oldest It's actually one of the oldest continually published in our field. The first edition appeared in 1970. And so with this latest seventh edition, we have a really dynamic revised name. As my co-editor, Misty Sailors notes, we have an international inclusion of diverse authorship with chapters representing contemporary and critical scholarship that's historically underrepresented in literacy research. And I'm noting the text as the two sections I led extend the goals of my research and teaching, examining the creative and artistic literacy artifacts and practices of youth and the global African diaspora. So super excited to be in conversation with folks today.
Thank you so much for introducing yourself. We have so many awesome people today, and today's guests are editors and co-authors of a special issue of the journal Theory into Practice. And the topic of this special issue is solidarity among immigrant literacy, and articles we'll be discussing focus on fibrous solidarity in digital spaces, transnational funds of knowledge for transnational solidarity, and visiting community spaces for pedagogical solidarity. Therefore, our first question is for the editors of the special issue. Given the diverse challenges and opportunities facing communities today, what led you and your co-authors to identify solidarity as a critical and timely theme for a special issue in the Theory into Practice?
Yes, thank you for the question. Our work on this special issue actually began through the Literacy Research Association Staff Fellowship, where I met Dr. Vaughn Watson as my mentor. Our conversation about youth, immigrant communities, and justice grew into a collaborative relationship, and that collaboration became the foundation for this special issue. For our team, choosing solidarity as the main theme felt very important and very urgent. After the racial event in 2020, many schools and educators tried to respond to racial violence. For example, Chicago shared a resource called Say Their Names, and New York City shared Stop Asian Hate. Across many areas in education, scholars were writing special issues about justice and working across racial groups. But a few years later, we began to see strong pushback. In the United States, new federal actions limited diversity, equity, and inclusion work. More than 10,000 books were banned. Many of them were people of color or LGBTQ plus people. Immigration rules also became stricter and hurt many young people and families. These changes were not just political news, they affected real lives, real classrooms, and real futures. In this moment, solidarity felt even more necessary. Even while some institutions tried to restrict what teachers could say or teach, we saw many acts of solidarity every day. Young people, families, and teachers across Asian, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities were building connections, helping each other, speaking up, and creating caring spaces. Their actions showed us that solidarity is not only an idea, it is something people practice in daily life. At the same time, many communities of color are still separated by race, language, and culture. Research and teaching often show these divides too. We felt there was a need for more examples of how communities can work together, learn from each other, and build strong relationships. The authors in this issue give many examples, including transnational knowledge from families, art-based work, community projects, and digital stories made by immigrant youth. Another important point is that this special issue also grew from solidarity. The idea came from two conference panels we organized at NCTE and LRA. Scholars from many backgrounds came together, shared ideas, and talked about what solidarity can look like in classrooms, community, and research today. These conversations became the heart of this issue. So in the end, we chose solidarity as the theme because it helps us see both the hard realities and the hopeful possibilities of this moment. And with that, I pause here.
Thank you so much for sharing your insight with us. We really appreciate you taking the time to unpack the thinking behind this important theme. From what you have shared, it's clear that solidarity become a central theme because it illuminates not only the structural challenges immigrant communities encounter, but also the relational and transnational practices through which they sustain one another. Next, we would like to turn our attention to the first article in this special issue, which explores Fiverr's solidarity in digital spaces. This article titled Fiverr Solidarity, Narrative in Digital Spaces as Pathway to Solidarity Among Immigrant Communities. Our questions for the authors of this article, Dr. Jin Kyeong Jung, Dr. Joel Berends, and Dr. Vaughn W is what unique aspect of digital spaces contribute to the formation and maintenance of solidarity within immigrant communities?
All right. So I'm gonna so thanks so much for this question. Really appreciate the questions and opportunity to kind of provide some nuanced thinking through these points. I'm going to return for a moment to a previous article I wrote with colleagues Ashley Taylor and Michelle Knight Manuel, and it was titled Beyond Talking and Texting, African Immigrant Youth's Social Civic Literacies and Negotiations of Citizenship Across New Media Technologies. And I'm mentioning that because we define social civic literacies as new civic knowledges and identities enacted across uses of participatory media or social media. So, for example, our participant talked about how they repurposed Facebook as a personal blog to sustain conversations about issues of personal interest across local or global context. And so there was this notion of social civic literacies that emerged in this piece that kind of sought to at once complicate and expand understandings of immigrant youth civic identities, or frame or reframe traditional parameters of formal or informal citizenship teaching and learning. So we talked about like how social civic literacies were I mean, particularly relevant in these times, right? When we know that youth and immigrant youth grapple with restrictive policies that delimit how folks bring their full selves, cultural, linguistic, cultural ways of knowing and being into schools. And simultaneously, right, we have these restrictions on in-school uses of social media, sites, mobile technologies. We're literally seeing this today in Australia, in this, like literally today. So we noted in this manuscript that considering social civic literacies reasserts this knowledge, linguistic, cultural assets that immigrant youth bring across new media technologies, formal and informal learning context. We argued that we wanted to think about, and this really gets at the question, we wanted to think about how social civic literacies might galvanize spaces of civic identity for immigrant youth, right? Enacting political literacies across new media technologies, reconceptualizing notions of citizenship, beyond this idea that you have to be 18 and can vote. We drew from a bunch of in-depth interviews, and we talked about how at the time, right, this is late 2010s, right? So this is like 2014, 15, 16. Folks were emerging as like users receiving information, or we talked about like user generators receiving and generating and sharing, but then also generators who would share or produce what we now know as content creators, probably. But circling back to the question, what unique aspects of digital spaces contribute to the formation and maintenance of solidarity within immigrant communities? I think there's three aspects or features that I really want to name, right? There's certainly, first, I want to name this always on, quite accessible to use and navigate, right? So, I mean, Pew most recent study, 84% of adults in the US reported that they use Facebook. I mean, I'm sorry, YouTube, followed closely by Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, WhatsApp. There was literally an article today in the Times that said, quote, most US teens use YouTube and TikTok daily, some almost constantly, right? Almost constantly. And so I want to pair that first point about this story is always on, always connected with the second point, which in our study that I mentioned, immigrant communities named the importance of things like watching BBC online or reading news from African home countries. So there was this urgent transglobal perspective, this notion of both and rather than either or, and how one might see themselves civically attuned or engaged. I'll just give a quick example. I pulled an example of Susan from Ghana and Maureen from Ghana. They were explaining how they stay in touch with peers using Facebook. And Susan said to Maureen and the interviewer, that's the way that we stay in touch, right? This whole Ghanaian group on Facebook. Maureen, being able to communicate and see what's going on amongst Ghanaian people our age, young people like us, that's really good. Susan said mostly social events, but there have been organizations that do community service or donate or collect money, remittances. And then Chike from Nigeria said Facebook is huge, right? It's late. This is like 2015, 16. But he said, I've already I have people sending me information about, different events, political, but more social events. So you could use that to do something, right? Or be something political. All my friends from Cote d'Ivoire, I'm in contact with them through Facebook. And then I think thirdly, the point that to be in conversation, no question what unique aspects of digital spaces contribute to the formation and maintenance of solidarity. I think there's the always on, quite accessible to use. There's the right this notion of moving of transglobal both and, but I think the third point, and I'm just getting into this in current work, is this notion of diasporic tellings, right? And so I have a colleague, Anisha Terry Young, and we're talking about like digital diasporic tellings, but and with some folks, we just had this recent research in the teaching of English themed issue on diasporic tellings of race, literacies, joys, and geographies in the lives of Black African immigrant youth. But I want to share this quote from Chinua Achebe, a Nigerian novelist, poet, and essayist. And he talks about the intentional naming, this urgency of a global balance of stories. And it resonates with Ndiche's notion as well. But Achebe said, look, quote, this is a quote, the last 400 or 500 years of European contact with Africa produced a body of literature that presented Africa in a very bad light and Africans in very lurid terms. And this is a Nigerian author, poet, and essayist writing and saying this. This continued until the Africans themselves in the middle of the 20th century took into their own hands the telling of their story. And so this is this notion of diasporic tellings in the digital space. If we talk about the affordances and think about the affordances of and these movements towards solidarity, the formation and maintenance of solidarity, I think 3 points that are sort of three sort of additional points that I think of. The urgency of diasporic tellings prompts us to think about this humanizing telling of one's story on one's terms, right? And so TikTok, social media, it can include features such as music or place-based scene setting of the author's choice that affirm and extend the range of identities that they seek to bring forth. A second is this notion of like a community of listening and storing, right? And an awareness of more or less an authentic audience. Like, so youth today who are leveraging the formation and maintenance of solidarity through these digital means, right? I always think about how folks, have, can you imagine if any of us had, 35,000, views on an article that we wrote or something like this, but there's an awareness of audience and they're telling a story, right, of oneself on one's terms. And then thirdly, this potential of youth toward action taking, right? This notion of digital activism, movements toward change, right? And we've seen in like roads must fall and fees must fall, hashtag movements in South Africa toward decolonizing curriculum, a halt to tuition increases in South Africa, cost of living, digital and social protest movements elsewhere on the continent. So those are some of the things I think about when I think about the urgency for us, taking seriously the necessity to build frameworks, methodological approaches, and teaching approaches that vibrantly assert the already present learning that youth move with in these digital spaces toward formations and maintenance and extensions of solidarity.
Yes, thank you for such a wonderful explanation. This kind of remind me also about critical media literacy. And it's very clear that digital space do provide powerful platforms for close cultural connection and also collectively identity building, especially in contexts shaped by, say, racism and misrepresentation among the mainstream. And also the spaces enable what you describe as solidarity moving, allow individual to change dominant narrative and to cultivate their interconnected, resilient relationship. And building on your insights about digital spaces, we would like to dive a little deeper into the concept of fibrous solidarity. So how does the fibrous nature manifest in online interactions?
Yeah, happy to take this one. First, thanks for the question and the opportunity to share our work. Hearing kind of what Vaughn was sharing already, there's something already deeply organic about community work, even if it's in an online platform, right? And to turn towards the sort of concept proposed of fibrous solidarity, I mean, you can see I'm a bit plant obsessed over here in my office. I surround myself with plants. I came to a love for plants at an early age. My mom was the kind of person that could walk through a forest and know all of the plants around her and share that knowledge and notice those things. And as we built our work together, we have to give a shout out to Dr. Berenda Montgomery, whose book, Lessons from Plants, Dr. Montgomery is a molecular biologist, a microbiologist, plant biologist, and also works in mentoring and leadership. I believe she's over at Grinnell College now. But yeah, in our work, we propose this concept of fibrous solidarity to understand the interconnected experiences of immigrant youth. And our findings reveal how digital spaces like TikTok facilitate the formation and these connections, these collective identities among immigrant youth. And we came to the concept of fibrous solidarity after spending time with Dr. Montgomery's work, as well as with our data set and with folks' voices on TikTok. So anyhow, the Lessons from Plants shares that how behavior, adaptation, and intentionality of plants, they offer profound lessons for human society. And they draw, like in our work, we try and draw connections between some of these things shared in plant science to human experiences. And basically, to frame our inquiry, we spent a lot of time learning with some of these solidarity moves that exist in nature. Learn from plants and learn from these solidarity moves that we experienced, heard, read, spent time with on TikTok. And we came up with 4 tenets to frame what we call fibrous solidarity. These tenets are first, the importance of narrative weaving. Second, adaptive resistance. Third, fostering resilience. And fourth, intentionally navigating misrecognition. And to go into a bit of each of those, right? This idea of narrative weaving is all about the importance of developing empathy that moves, right, towards, in the plant realm, this like mutual beneficial support, right? We think of like an ecosystem. I think of my backyard. There's a giant walnut tree right over here out this window, and only certain things can grow under it. And the things that do grow can thrive, right? But if someone tries to plant just a run-of-the-mill plant from a garden store, it will not survive there, right? It's not the right condition for it, right? So how do we think with things that like root a mutual respect of diverse cultural narratives where each community's unique struggles are acknowledged and valued, right? This is this idea of narrative weaving. What is it like to have these conditions for mutually beneficial support? And the second tenet is this idea of adaptive resistance and solidarity, right? Where communities engage in resilient action and strategies to counter systems of oppression. Vaughn was alluding to some of those things happening right now, right? This form of resistance is deeply connected to how maybe a particular plant species assesses and responds to their surroundings, right? Plants communicate with each other, and they assess threats, right? And we think of like the digital spaces and communities as a collective, but also as a collective that is making sense of this world and systems of oppression in very distinct communities. And these communities are established, created, they're adaptive, right? And there's something very organic about that. The third tenet is this idea of facilitating an ecosystem of resilience, right? Here it's all about the collaborative or collective action. Think of like community support and communities of sharing or shared care. Here we envision a solidarity as a network of roots that interconnect individuals and communities, allowing for resource sharing and mutual support. Just like how roots spread in multiple directions, right? Resilience in human communities can be fostered through diverse adaptive strategies that build strength from the ground up, right? And finally, the fourth tenet is navigating criticism and intentionally challenging misrecognition, right? And this final tenet explores how communities can actively refuse misrecognition through, for example, practices like strategic silence or reclaiming power. We think of like how something blows up on TikTok, right? Often it's in anger or in jest, right? But there's something very strategic about even the communication of that platform, but also in the like reclaiming of narratives and stories, just as Vaughn again alluded to in that which is shared by Achebe and Adichie, right? This sort of balance of stories, it's there. If folks are in a digital space and creating content, they're engaging in so much strategic work that is a sort of resisting solidarity, right? And finally, we embrace, right, this idea of reclaiming through our engagement across communities on TikTok. And we build with how content creators are creating, not only creating, but reclaiming through these narratives and cultivating their personal identities as well as their broader collective identities. And doing all of this in a way that I think speaks back in a way to the algorithm, right? And many of these sort of like tropes in media and misrepresentations of folks. So that's a little bit about how it connects, right? And some of our framing for our work. Thanks for letting us share.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights and vivid experience of plants. From what you shared, the fibrous nature of solidarity really emerged from the ongoing weaving of diverse stories, active resistance and solidarity, and facilitating ecosystem of resilience and navigating this recognition and moments of mutual recognition in online spaces. This interaction created a resilient, interconnected network where immigrant communities continually build collective strengths. Now we'd like to turn to the next article in the special issue, which is about transnational funds of knowledge for transnational solidarity. In the article titled Towards Transnational Solidarity, Transnational Funds of Knowledge as Counter-Story to Epistemic Injustice, Dr. Kwon, please share how you define transnational fund of knowledge.
Yeah, hey, and thank you for this question. I think to talk about transnational funds of knowledge, we first need to understand the concept of funds of knowledge, which was introduced by Louis Malle and his colleagues. And it explains the bodies of knowledge, skills, and experiences that are rooted in immigrant households. And rather than viewing these forms of knowledge through a deficit lens, this concept calls for educators and researchers to recognize and elevate them as assets for teaching and learning. And I think funds of knowledge is one of the concepts that we always like emphasize as teacher educators here at Michigan State University. And this idea has shaped how many educators and researchers think about immigrant children and families and the rich knowledge and experiences they bring. However, much of the discussion around funds of knowledge has focused only on immigrant experiences within the boundaries of the United States, even though many immigrant children and families today live transnational lives and engage in transnational literacies. So, by combining the concept funds of knowledge and the idea of transnationalism, the ways people build and sustain connections across countries, we argue that immigrant children and families hold rich knowledge that are grounded in their mobility and transnational networks. And immigrant children and families, they build and expand and circulate their transnational funds of knowledge as they move across geographic borders, whether they engage in physical visits or they cross geographical boundaries linguistically or culturally, or even through their imagination. So in our co-author articles, we do discuss several examples, such as a Nepali immigrant family where grandparents introduce Hindu religious scripts, religious myth, and cultural values to the grandchildren. So here the grandfather is drawing on his connections to Nepal and using his transnational fund of knowledge to teach heritage language and culture to the next generations. We also talk about a Korean American child who expanded his understanding of Korean history and connected that to the US history while visiting museums in Korea and interacting with multilingual signs and artifacts. We also talk about a trilingual child whose parents are Korean ethnic minorities from China, and how this girl makes sense of her really complex and multi-layer connections to Korea, China, and the US while engaging with photographs from her transnational visits. We then also talk about how immigrant mothers of children with disabilities form the group online and circulate their knowledge and build solidarity in these online communities and supported each other. So I think all of these examples show how immigrant children and families have rich knowledge that is really rooted in their own and unique ways of transnational ways of living and being, and how they expend and mobilize these resources and knowledge as they build solidarity and navigate their lives in the US.
Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that concept. So transnational funds of knowledge definitely go beyond what we usually know about like what families know within a single home or community. So they draw from people's experiences moving across country, across culture, and across contexts. And building on your explanation, we would like to explore its implication a little bit further. So, in what ways can recognizing and integrating those funds challenging existing epistemically in injustices?
Yeah. I think Asian immigrant children and families have long been positioned and described through stereotypical portrayers as model minorities who excel academically and don't really need support, or perpetual foreigners who don't belong to the US. I think one good example is how my Korean American 7-year-old daughter was recently told by her peer that she should go back to Korea because she speaks Korean. So likewise, these children's linguistic and cultural assets are often viewed through deficit lenses. If they speak Korean, you should go back to Korea rather than really celebrating their bilingual assets. And this idea of perpetual foreigner, like seeing Korean Asian immigrants as someone who don't belong to US is really pervasive. And I think it's because much emphasis is placed on this US-centric Western ideas in school, and we often focus on how proficient they are in English rather than seeing bilingual assets and celebrating them. So these assumptions and false stereotypical narratives produce epistemic injustices. They devalue immigrant children's knowledge. They erase the histories and experience that shape the children's lives. And research also shows that in US schools and textbooks, Asian immigrant, Asian American histories are often erased and marginalized. So one of my participant children in my previous studies often said, school is so boring. We only learn about American history. And I think he well captures what many Asian immigrant children are experiencing in schools every day. So for the particular child, like although he knew a lot about Korean history, he had almost no opportunities to share or build on that knowledge in school. So recognizing immigrant children's transnational funds of knowledge directly challenges these injustices, because when we take seriously what children know about histories, languages, and cultures of their own or parental homeland, we counter that assumption that only US-centric knowledge and English are valued. And by creating regular and sustained opportunities for these children to share their stories and experiences, not just during Asian Heritage Month, but throughout the year, we legitimize their knowledge that is built across generations and borders and challenge curriculum violence. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize the diversity of transnational experiences that children bring to schools, because some children and families travel to their homelands frequently, and others cannot travel at all due to financial reasons or immigration status, or just being in this current social political climate. It's hard for many families to just imagine being back in their home countries. And some children build that transnational funds of knowledge through parent-child reading or reading books or having conversations with their grandparents. And others do that through social media or watching ethnic media and just interacting with pop culture and more. And I think our research shows that even within the same family, children's multilingual and transnational knowledge and experiences may differ depending on their age, birth order, language they speak, or migration experiences. So one thing that we really emphasize in this article is that it's really important for educators to understand and acknowledge this rich transnational funds of knowledge that immigrant children and families bring to schools and society, actively learn about them, and center them in educational spaces and beyond.
Thank you for sharing those insights about transnational funds of knowledge. Integrating transnational funds of knowledge acts as a counter to epistemic injustice by validating the diverse experience of immigrant students. It not only supports its learners, but also fosters solidarity and critical consciousness and a more equitable classroom where multiple forms of knowledge are recognized and valued. Finally, we'd like to turn to the last article we'll be discussing, which is about visiting community spaces for pedagogical solidarity. This question is for the authors of the article titled Community Spaces as Sites of Pedagogical Solidarity for and with Immigrant Children. Dr. Cárdenas Curiel and Ms. Cheung, could you elaborate on specific characteristic or design principles that make a community space particularly effective in fostering pedagogical solidarity?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for this invitation again. When we think about being in solidarity with and for immigrant children in community spaces, just like Dr. Kwon was talking about, not just in education spaces, but also beyond these spaces, we think about how we can use them as teaching and learning sites that will enrich and enhance immigrants' learning experiences by considering their home and cultural language and literacy practices. So really in connection to what Dr. Kwon was talking about, the funds of knowledge, and not just only their funds of knowledge or transnational funds of knowledge in asset-based ways. So we found it helpful to ground that conversation in 4 different guiding principles that have emerged from the work that I started with the support and help of Ming Cheung and Jatunde Alabidi as we in our teacher preparation program, we, with our help of many doctoral instructors, among, I think at this point, more than 2,000 pre-service teachers have visited different community spaces, and mostly they mirror most of our teachers in the nation, which are white middle class teachers, which is important for us at this moment to understand what are the experiences of immigrant communities at this moment. So these four guiding principles that have emerged from this work when we visit different community spaces such as art museums and gardens and science museum and Smithsonian's museum, we first think of that these spaces allow pre-service teachers to make authentic connections to real-world events and to family and community knowledge that immigrant children already bring. They bring all of this to these spaces. So in these field experiences, when they go, they try to unpack what is it about these community settings immigrant families bring, right? So what are the ways that they can shape some learning opportunities that are available for the children? So they see these places up close and they recognize that learning not only happen in the four walls, but they happen beyond, as Dr. Kwon said. So for example, some of the students noticed that the literacy practices in some of these community spaces are only in English, right? And that makes them think a little bit more critically in ways of, well, maybe we should open up these spaces and try to provide other writing that is not that is in their home languages of immigrant communities. Another guiding principle that we have found is that some of these spaces are intentionally designed to invite participation and engagement and deep reflection. So community spaces are not passive, right? There are ways that we can do a lot of hands-on components. So for example, in the children's garden, we explored flowers. So a lot of the connections that Dr. Berends was talking about plants, right? And the realia, and we work with science. So it's a lot about learning, not just writing and language literacies, but also disciplinary literacies as well. So one of the comments that our pre-service teachers say sometimes is that they have to like shift their white and English speaking gaze and think about what are other perspectives that I can see in these spaces where I can participate in different ways. As well, and reflect about how I can support the learning in ways that immigrant communities can participate and engage and reflect. The third guiding principle is thinking about multimodality and multiliteracies. So a lot of our education coordinators that we collaborate with help us in thinking about interactive learning and collaborative discussions and using a lot of multimodal modes of communication. So for example, through art. The Broad Art Museum here supports us a lot in thinking about how we can use the visual, the spatial and cultural exploration. So some of them work in poetry and art and feel all those joyful moments. And some of our students have say they have considered like when they participate in these activities, it's fun, like they laugh. So learning can be fun. It's not just stressful, right? And that for us, we want teachers to know that it's just not about, having to memorize something, but it's also about being engaged and having fun and bringing joy to learning. And the fourth principle is making clear connections, right, between what they're learning at that moment, the pre-service teachers, and what they can bring in their future classroom practices, and how they can incorporate this community funds of knowledge, which can also be transnational. For example, the Art Broad Museum brings a lot of the art from other different worlds, and they make connections too from other different parts of the world, and try to break, those barriers or those different borders, right? And trying to connect with each other and be in community with each other. So we talk about these spaces as sites of pedagogical solidarity, right? When we look at these four principles together. So they're not just locations, but they are like an ecosystem together where we honor multilingualism and we prepare teachers to build these classrooms in solidarity and respect with and for immigrant children. And Ming is going to add some of the other things that we discuss in the article where we have some other implications as we engage with these four guiding principles.
Yeah, thank you, Lucia, for sharing the guiding principles for designing and implementing community visits. So one thing we've noticed in our work is that community spaces become powerful sites of pedagogical solidarity when we not just treat these spaces as field trip destinations, but we see them as places where teachers and teacher educators can learn with the community rather than just learning about the community. So I'm going to talk a little bit about two implications that we came away with, teaching the course and also writing the chapter, and how these principles can be applied in different university and maybe even K-12 settings. So the first implication is that community spaces are most impactful when educators take time to build relationship with the resource people. And by resource people, I'm talking about like the coordinator or the community leaders who have a lot of knowledge of the space. So partnering with them helps make sure the visits are purposeful rather than superficial. And these partners can point us toward the strength and need within the community and help us align our course goal with what the space actually offers. So for myself, I've taught this course for a little over 2 years. And one thing I've noticed is that as our partnership grows, we see a real shift in how community partners interact with our pre-service teachers. They don't just guide them through the activities, they actually started asking questions like, how would you adapt this to support multilingual learners? So they're intentionally pushing the pre-service teachers to think a step further. And what is powerful is that this interaction is not just one directional. So our community partners are also learning. They begin reflecting on ways that they can better support pre-service teachers and also students whose first languages are not English. And then they share those reflections openly. And I remember towards the end of several visits, the partners would actually close by saying like, feel free to reach out when you bring in your own student so we can plan activities in advance to support the multilingual learners. So for me, I think that's where the solidarity becomes visible. It's not just in what we plan, but also in the relationship that we grow over time, where everyone is learning with and from each other. And another implication is that the spaces, the places that we choose, the variety matters. So we encourage teacher educator to choose multiple types of spaces. For example, in our case, we chose a garden, an art museum, and also a Smithsonian museum. So pre-service teachers can see how community knowledge is interdisciplinary. And this is really important because our pre-service teachers come from different majors. So there's history major, there's art major, there's English language art. So the exposure to different types of spaces really help them understand how content learning intersects with linguistic and also cultural knowledge. So when pre-service teachers walk through those spaces, they begin noticing both assets and also inequities. For example, some museums, just like what Lucia said earlier, they have a lot of multimodal exhibits where visitors can smell or touch the objects. But they also notice a lot of like the little information labels are almost entirely in English, which limits accessibility. So in some reflection, pre-service teachers started critically reflecting on these experiences, and they start thinking about pedagogical strategies that would make these spaces more inclusive for multilingual learners. And when these kind of reflection happen, I think that's another moment where solidarity becomes visible.
Yeah, thank you to both for sharing such thoughtful insights and your amazing work on immigrant children and immigrant community. It's really important for us to understand that children's learning is not only passive, and it also can be fun and can be engaging. Community spaces can create environments where immigrant children's language and their culture are respected and incorporated into learning. So, by supporting multiple forms of expression, encouraging hands-on engagement, and connecting learning to real-life experiences like museum and garden, these spaces can build confidence, strengthen solidarity, and can help children see themselves as capable, as knowledgeable participants in their communities. And as we begin to wrap up, we would like to ask the last question. Based on your research on solidarity, what message or call to action would you like to share with scholars, policymakers, educators, or practitioners working to support immigrant literacies?
I can start since I finished up. Well, we live right now in a very tense social political climate, and we are marked by anti-immigrant rhetoric and ICE raids, and immigrant communities live with very real fear, right? And as a first generation immigrant and te we think teacher educators and teacher educators, we must take this very seriously, this context, and think carefully about how we consider our work, right? Solidarity begins with responsibility. So we need to recognize what methods are we using, how are we creating our relationships, and that decisions matter, right? And because our communities, when we're working with immigrant communities, we're navigating a lot of uncertainty, right? And as I had the opportunity 2 months ago to go and get closer to our community in the state of Michigan, I realized that communities are at the center, and I wrote about it. I talk about who we are and where we come from and how we sustain ourselves, right? And we need to think about that there is hope if we focus on that, if we focus on our culture and our language and our empathy and people's stories and joy and history and humility, right? And those are the places where immigrant literacies live and grow, right? So we need to collaborate with each other, not against each other. So that for me is solidarity. If we listen to immigrant communities, if we honor their lived experiences, if we work in responsibility with them and with and not for, but the people whose literacies we hope to support, right? And if we go into the communities, if we look into these literacies, and if we root into this culture, we help nourish the future, right? I know right now we don't see that hope, but I did see it when I was traveling through all the Upper Peninsula, right? I saw all those connections, and I hope that I can keep seeing it. But we do have to act very responsibly.
I'll just build directly on that point to note that, I think about approaches to the work. So if I'm thinking about methodological approaches, if I'm thinking about theoretical approaches, and moving forward with all of the thoughtfulness that Lucia is noting, and really encouraging us to think about what it means to urgently engage and build with frameworks and methodological approaches that are resonant and affirming of the communities with whom we work. And so, as literacy scholars, when we're reviewing work, when we're sharing work, naming when there's a mismatch and asking folks to revisit their frameworks and revisit their well, to build with their communities and affirm their communities in their frameworks. And I think in when you I've been thinking a lot about this notion of telling this smaller story, but not smaller as as in less consequential, but the sort of the up close story, if you will. And I'm just noting that those stories are full of joy, full of laughter, as Lucia is noting. And so I'm just encouraging us to to move in the way our colleagues are naming and really assert those moments of joy and find actively think with ways that our frameworks and our methodological approaches name those points and sort of privilege those points, move those points forward. And as one quick example, Jen and Joel, I'm just thinking with, how for a companion piece, I'll just say, we had we're doing an analysis and we were moving with notions of we were using Black crit and Asian crit as theoretical lenses. And we found that we needed to even go further to deeply affirm the communities. And we moved with notions of Ubuntu thinking with African immigrant communities and notions of Jung thinking with Asian immigrant communities. And perhaps, Jen, you can, if you'd like, expand on that a bit, but it was just a really nuanced way of enacting all of these great points that all of my colleagues here have shared.
I think too of I can't help but think of what you shared, Dr. Kwon, about your child, right? A 7-year-old. When we talk about solidarities, right? This is necessary work, and there's a certain solidarity in the reaction of a classmate who says what they said, right? There's a certain solidarity around language education and instruction. But what I'm hearing from y'all's work is like there are alternative solidarities, and those are the necessary ones to grow, to create conditions for flourishing. So yeah, I'm grateful for y'all and the work that you're in, and I'm excited to continue to think about ways to share it, and to do it in ways that are meaningful and as you just outlined, Vaughn, closer to communities. Moving with stories, not just small stories, but moving with the stories that aren't the ones that often set the algorithms and what that can be. So yeah, I appreciate being in conversation with y'all.
Yeah, so I can go next. When I think about solidarity, I think a lot about really knowing our community. For example, like the cultural linguistic landscape, the history, and because we're working with literacy practices, is important to kind of note what everyday literacy practices are available in the community spaces. And just like what Dr. Kwon said earlier, like immigrant communities, they already have a lot of rich resources and their ways of making meaning. And by tapping into those strengths, allowed us to support multilingual learners and their families more thoughtfully. And I think when we understand our community better that we serve, we can plan the instruction that is responsive and grounded in our students' lived experiences. And I know that Lucia said it earlier, you touched on that a little bit. I also think that solidarity work requires humility. We need to recognize that we don't really know too much. How do I say this? We need to recognize that we're not the expert of our students' life, and we really need to take the time to like walk around the neighborhood, visit the community spaces, and even talk with community members. They're a really good starting point to understand the context our students are navigating, especially in this very difficult socio-political climate. So I think investing time to know our students and communities is how solidarity begins.
I want to build on what Ming just shared. I also think building solidarity really begins with positioning immigrant children and families as experts who has knowledge, experiences, and skills that we need to learn from. And we shouldn't just say that, but really enact it. And as we work with them in our research and teaching, and I think listening to children is so important. They have so many stories that they want to share with us. It's just us that need to make time and carefully listen to them. Also, as we design our studies, we need to think about what are ways to honor their ways of making sense and sharing thoughts, and what can we do to better learn about their experiences. Oftentimes, like I find how some would just like ask questions in English in a quiet room and prepare interview protocol. And I don't think that is the right way to engage in conversations with immigrant children when they have really rich multimodal and multilingual ways of expressing their thoughts. Also, working with immigrant communities is important, but we all know that it's hard work. And that's why I admire scholars in this call because they're really doing that in very reciprocal and relational ways. But we also know that it requires times and efforts and you need to be there. But that's really the direction that I, as a researcher and teacher educator, want to take. And I really want to learn alongside immigrant children and families and help our teacher candidates and teachers join our efforts in building solidarity and moving toward equities and justice in schools and society.
Yeah, I just wanted to add what Dr. Vaughn Watson said about the Asian concept Jung, the Korean cultural specific concept Jung. It can refer to attachment, empathy, caring, also ethical consideration. So I would like to conclude with listen closely to immigrant youth and their families and let their stories guide our work. So solidarity can grow when we learn with them, not just about them.
Thank you for sharing. We've heard that in the current political climate, immigrant experiences often remain unseen, which means educators and researchers need to take our work and method even more seriously. It was emphasized that immigrant communities hold rich assets, especially their literacy, knowledge, and ways of being, and the community spaces are where these assets live, grow, and foster solidarity. These spaces need our recognition, support, and honoring their experiences. And thank you for sharing that. We also heard about the urgency of engaging with framework and methodological approaches that truly resonate with the communities we work with. Importantly, since we are not the expert of this community, we approach them as learners, positioning immigrant families and children as the expert, honoring their experiences and reviewing, sharing, and naming our work alongside them. In this way, we heard that we can build with the communities, not simply studying them from a distance. Thank you so much for your sharing your insights. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of Inquiring Minds focused on solidarity through immigrant literacies. And a big thank you to our participants, the editors, and authors of this special issue for an engaging and insightful conversation we have today. We have thoroughly enjoyed hearing from those amazing scholars, and we are confident that our listeners will do as well. Yay!
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for hosting us.
Thank you.